Good afternoon, and welcome to the second day of our series of events on the Walkouts. Today is movie day. We're going to see two films today and hear from the filmmakers after each screening. Our first film will be Taking Back the Schools, which was part of the Chicano, the History of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement documentary series that showed on public television in 1996. And we'll be looking at an episode directed or produced by Susan Racho. And then we'll screen Walkout, the feature film that showed on HBO based on the events of the Walkout, produced by Moctesuma Esparza, and hear from him afterwards. So what I'm going to do is just give a brief introduction to Susan, and she has a few words she'd like to share with you before the screening, and then we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for a discussion. I first became aware of Susan's work through a public affairs television series that she was involved in, that really in some ways were the beginning of Chicano cinema. It's where a lot of the filmmakers were able to get the resources to make short films and to get the message about what was happening in the Chicano community out to a broader audience. And in particular, she was involved with a series called Reflexiones and another one called Realidades. Reflexiones was on ABC, so it was on one of the major networks. And she also worked on a series that the McGraw-Hill Broadcasting, these are the folks that do the encyclopedias, called the La Raza series. I should point to you that the Reflexiones series, we have digital copies of all of those 52 episodes. And I encourage you to come to the center and to make arrangements to see them. It is one of the most innovative public affairs shows that you can imagine. These are people that didn't know the rules yet, and so they broke them in very creative ways that really helped something new come into American television. Since that time, Susan has been an award-winning producer and writer working here in Los Angeles. She's been a member of the Producers Guild of America. And I encourage you to see one of the other really significant feature-length documentaries that she made, The Bronze Screen, 100 Years of the Latino Image in Hollywood Cinema, from 2002, which also showed on HBO. And not just because I make an appearance in it, with dressed impeccably, full head of hair, making absolute sense. I've never seen myself so articulate, so she's a great editor. I want to emphasize that. Susan's also really been extremely active, just more generally, within the kind of realm of documentary or news coverage, and has credits that include Carlos Fuentes' The Buried Mirror series, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, the East L.A. series, the Astronomer series, and even, dare I say, Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Okay. I will leave the rest to Susan to kind of introduce the film. I just want to say that this work has not gone unnoticed. We're very proud to be able to archive both the Bronze Screen and Reflexiones here at the center. But she's also received an Emmy as a producer of the Best Special Events Coverage, the Imagen Award for Most Outstanding Documentary, and the Nosotros Golden Eagle Award as the producer of the Best Informational Programming. So without further ado, Susan Racho.
Good afternoon and welcome all. Thank you for your interest in this film, and thank you to the Chicano Studies Research Center, particularly Carlos Aro for all his work in organizing this conference and photo exhibit commemorating the Walkouts of 1968. Just a few words to briefly introduce the film. Taking Back the Schools was one of 4 episodes in the series, as Chon mentioned, Chicano, History of the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, which initially was broadcast on national PBS in 1996. Prior to the broadcast, I worked with the National Latino Communications Center in the research and development phase, which spanned at least 2 years' time. During this R&D phase, a few of us conducted extensive audio interviews with dozens of activists, organizers, and participants involved in the Chicano movement throughout the Southwest. Meeting these people and hearing their stories was, for me, the most enjoyable aspect of the research phase. The development phase, which is just a fancy way of saying raising the money phase to make this film, to me is always the least enjoyable and the most difficult. Convincing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS that a series about the Chicano civil rights movement would be of interest to a national audience was equally difficult. With regard to content and production, the biggest challenge was how to tell the story of the Chicano movement in a mere 4 hours. Certainly, our community's history of struggle and resistance began decades before the 60s, but given the limited funding, we decided to focus on that period of activism roughly from the late 60s to early 70s. But even with this narrow time focus, we knew the series could only highlight certain events and hopefully encourage further school classroom reading and discussion. The content of the 4 episodes would generally cover the subject areas of labor, politics, education, and the land grant movement. When we moved into the production phase, I assumed the role of producer and writer, director of the episode about the 1968 East L.A. Walkouts, which made logical sense to me since I was at the Walkouts and involved as many of us university and college students were. When we began actual production in 1994, some 26 years had already passed. So locating archival footage was initially a worry and a challenge. We knew that many still photographs of the walkouts were available, but moving images and archival footage are really essential in making historical documentaries. Fortunately, the production team was able to locate actual footage of the walkouts, subsequent arrests, the protests, and demonstrations that followed. On a more personal note, I came to UCLA as a freshman, or maybe a fresh woman, I'm not sure, 52 years ago in 1966. And I'm proud to say that I was one of the original members of UMAS, United Mexican American Students, in 1967. There's a couple other in here too. Reynaldo, of course, my compadre, is an OG as well. There were very few of us back then. As I recall, I think there were about 60 of us in a total student population of 20,000. Though my memory is a bit fuzzy about specific events that happened 5 decades ago, I do remember Sal Castro coming to one of our UMAS meetings in Kirchhoff Hall and asking us to act as monitors at the various East L.A. high schools for the students that would be walking out, and to help the kids, to help protect the kids from the police beating them on their cocos. He used that word, cocos. And if any cocos were to be hit, it would be better that they would be our cocos. Of course, we all said yes, and we also coordinated college student support through UMAS Central with other UMAS chapters from every college campus in the greater LA area, some in some even San Bernardino and Orange County. This was a time there was no internet, no cell phones, no social media, and I still wonder how we managed to communicate so effectively. Most of us were just a year or 2 out of high school ourselves, and we knew all too well how the cards were stacked against Chicano students in inferior and racist public schools, and that demanding a good education was key to breaking the cycle of poverty in our communities. My mother went to Lincoln High School in the 1930s, and I remember her telling me that when she and her friends were caught speaking Spanish, and that just even a casual greeting or saying goodbye, that they'd be scolded and reprimanded by teachers and administrators. But my mom and her friends, she said, kept forgetting about that ridiculous rule and were always getting in trouble for speaking what came naturally to them. Fast forwarding to March 6, 1968, Becky Sandoval and I hitch a ride with Moctesuma Esparza in his beat-up little Volkswagen to Lincoln High School, where UCLA UMA students were to act as the monitors for the high school students who would indeed walk out that day, as did thousands of other high school students all over the city in the days and weeks to come. It was a watershed event and a defining moment for the Chicano civil rights movement. That day, the weeks, months, and even several years that were to follow were remarkable and memorable in more ways than I can say. Oddly enough, both Moctesuma and I ended up working in the TV and film industry. In fact, soon after programming executives at HBO saw the PBS broadcast of Taking Back the Schools, they invited us in for a meeting to express their interest in making a feature film based on the documentary, which resulted in Mocte's film, Walkout, which we'll screen later this afternoon. So after the film, I understand there'll be a brief Q&A if you have any questions. We'll talk then. Thank you for coming.
Wow. Charlotte said something that had been going through my mind while watching it, which is, seeing this now as opposed to when it came out or any time in between. But looking at this in 2018, it's hard not to see Emma Gonzalez up there, the kids at Parkland, the situation that affects us now in terms of public education. Not because it's the same, but because it's so very different. And I just wonder, do you have any thoughts about where this history that we've been looking at, that goes back 50 years, but also a statement like this film, which is a very powerful expression by the participants,
Absolutely.
On all sides.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me also is that the anti-Mexican sentiment that Sal talks about is still just as prevalent and today as then. All the talk of building a wall and deporting Mexicans, there's an incredibly strong anti-Mexican sentiment, I think, that's going on now in this country, and specific to Mexicans. So I think that there's been a little progress, I'd say, in schools. Certainly we've got a lot more students, coming going into higher education. A little bit, schools are getting a little bit better, but still so much work to be done. So much work to be done, in my view.
When you hit on a point about Mexican, and right now we've got the term Chicanx as a way of really trying to get a positive discussion about Mexican descent people into public discourse, whether it's education, entertainment, news media. But we also have a president that really got elected by focusing on bad hombres and by castigating a Mexican-American judge as being biased because of his ethnicity and national background.
Absolutely. And it's the odd thing is that, or rather the surprising thing is that I knew there was, that there was a lot of racism in the country, but I didn't realize how much. That to me was really surprising. To be able to, for this country to elect a president based on a racist platform was really shocking.
Sexism too.
And sexist too. Oh yeah, he's definitely a creep.
What do you really think? That raises another issue related to that, and then we should open it up for questions. Rage, anger. You heard Moctesuma talking about that, and there's fear alongside of that as well. You are being taken down by the institutional forces of the most powerful country in the nation, and you're part of that nation. What about that anger, and what does that do, and how do you use that?
Well, I think it's interesting. In 1968 was really an incredible time, and there certainly was fear. There was a lot of persecution. Justified paranoia. Justified paranoia. I'm not even sure there's a word for that.
It's called you're paranoid and they're after you.
Right, and you're being put in jail. As Moctesuma said, all of the arrests and the way the FBI and and the police came down on the movement really did, like put us everybody into reverse, and ended up just defending ourselves. But I think today, you see, there's some anger, certainly like in Florida with regard to gun control and all, and there. I think you're seeing it also like in a number of high schools where Chicano students are, who still see that there's just as, some of the problems are just as bad as they were then, in terms of still getting a good education. The schools still are largely segregated and very uneven sort of resources that are made available to them. So.
Well, and we were having discussions yesterday with a number of folks that are teaching at high school and college levels, and their students don't know about this history, even those that came from many of these schools. So there is that issue in terms of the historical knowledge or awareness about where you fit into the world. Any questions? I want to open this up at this point so that people have seen the film. Do you have a question?
Here's a microphone.
Yeah, I'm the
microphone.
I'll be the one going up and down like an old school Oprah.
Okay, we have a question in the back there. Thought you were just going to throw it.
Hello. Okay, so my question is, how do you manage to concise such much information in such a small documentary? And what was your strategy when you were editing this documentary?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it really was a challenge, in conceptualizing the entire series. We knew we had resources that we could only afford to make 4 hours of about the Chicano civil rights movement, and that was difficult, very, very difficult. In terms, the way we decided to break it down: labor, politics, education, and the land grant movement, focusing on a time period, roughly late 60s, early 70s. What ended up happening, of course, we were somewhat limited by the actual footage that we were able to find in order to weave a story, to make it, and there was so much to cover, and there's so much left out. But, as I said, we had hoped just to highlight certain events that happened and to talk about certain issues, and that would hopefully, generate interest enough so that, classroom readings and discussion, would continue more research. But to us, ultimately, it was important to document this history. The walkouts in and of itself, the walkouts themselves, one of the demands was that our history be told. And in order for it to be told, we needed to document it. So just making the series was a struggle in itself. As I mentioned, convincing Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, that a story about Mexican-American civil rights was of interest to a national audience wasn't easy. We really had to do some selling, and we pulled all of our resources, collected all of the Chicano producers and talent that we had in order to sell ourselves and to sell the idea and to get the show done. I hope that answers your question.
Well, and that was such a big push that had to be done to get that funding. And you have to put it into context. That meant that's all that was going to get funded.
Yep, that was it.
That public television put roughly enough money into the pot every year for Latino programming to make, if you used all that money for one thing, you could make an hour of public television, an hour-long documentary. So that when Susan mentions the role of development is, you have to go out there and raise it from somewhere else. And that just it was an extraordinary effort just to get that point. In the same way that part of the story that this documentary is telling is there was the protest against failure to educate, And then all of that energy had to go to just put that teacher who was already there back into the classroom. And that's one of the cruel ironies of the way in which our society responded to
Right,
this.
absolutely. And I mean, in the case of Sal, I mean, everything, to Sal, those kids were the most important thing to him. I mean, and for him to, you know, be threatened with losing his job, I mean, or basically not being able to teach was devastating. I mean, and incredibly, something that he just couldn't, you know, probably do without.
So in case the question actually comes from somebody that wants to be a filmmaker, I'm going to just identify one thing I saw and then ask Susan to give away another trade secret, which is in the course of hearing somebody speak, suddenly you have the narrator come in the middle of that and talk over them. And initially it's a little annoying. You're like, I want to hear. It's like when you're watching somebody speaking Spanish on television, then the translator comes in. It's like, no, keep it down. I want to hear what he's actually saying, or she's actually saying. But that's a neat technique, because you're kind of taking out a section where they may not be really saying anything that pushes the narrative forward. And so you have the narrator drop in, and then you come back and you hear. And it's actually it creates more of a dialogue effect in a way. So do you have any other tricks of how you condensed a lot of material and really moved the story forward?
Well, we initially, you know, once all of the on-camera interviews were done, there's so much to choose from, and in order to, you know, like pulling, you know, certain phrases and words. You know, of course, Moctesuma has a great way with words, so he was easy. He speaks in perfect sound bites, so it's easy for it to pull. Of course, Reynaldo, is always eloquent and
so handsome too.
Yeah, of course. We had what I'd say is what I forget the term, but we had so much to choose from that condensing it down was tough. But the narration, of course, helps to move the story arc along, and to bridge the gap, introduce people. But as I said, unfortunately, we only had 1 hour to talk about education, and that wasn't enough. Just enough to just get.
Well, your
excited about the
first decision in some ways was to focus on one incident in one city. That was certainly it was an exemplary case, but you were using that to stand in for a national focus of the documentary series. So, any other questions up here? And Carlos, you're gonna have to be our timekeeper here. I don't have a watch anymore.
Were you ever allowed access to either FBI or LAPD or LA County Sheriff Archives to locate any type of information and/or photographs?
That was a difficult one. Basically, no. And most of the photographs and footage came from a number of sources, but certainly the local television stations. We had, and I know that we did ask, but didn't get much of a response from from police sources.
They're pretty bad. We have a colleague here, a professor here, Kelly Lighto Hernandez, who recently published a book on criminal justice system in Los Angeles at the late 19th, early 20th century. And she had a hard time getting information. This is a century ago. In terms of the treatment of Mexican Americans by the criminal justice system. So they're pretty tight-lipped. We did manage to get very redacted versions of the Ruben Salazar murder kind of inquiries, but that was 2011. You mentioned, you probably also noticed that Carlos Munoz, obviously he himself was using Freedom of Information Act to try to get this information on himself.
That he got after the fact, of course.
Yeah.
the COINTELPRO reports and all. Got a question?
Yes, right here.
You know, it seemed after the LA 13 that the organizations became a little bit disillusioned with the original request that they were asking for. How long did it take for the movement, for the board to start hiring more Chicano teachers and for the movement really to take, roots?
Well, certainly, even though the board actually made promises that the changes would be made, recruiting, took time. Some of the educators, here in the room could probably answer that question a little bit, more authoritatively than I could, but it was gradual, and to this day, I think we're still not, we don't have as many teachers or particularly counselors. The ratio of counselors to students, and particularly, Mexican American counselors, I think is still very inadequate. Deb?
I did some comparison of student demands versus what it looks like today. I'm not a school board, I'm not an LAUSD shill. In 1968, there were 49 high schools. There was one principal with a Spanish surname in 1968, and that Spanish surname principal was not on the east side. Today, the statistics that the board puts out is that there are 43%, and there's probably about 3,500 administrator types in the district. 43% of them, the school district identifies as Latino. There are other things, and I gave Carlos a listing of demands versus. One of the demands was to get rid of corporal punishment. And in I want to say 84, but I think it was a little before that, corporal punishment was abolished by the LA Unified School District. There are more. Oh, I know which one. This is a cool one. In 1968, students were demanding that parent councils be formed to help in the decision-making of the school district and the local schools. Every school in Los Angeles Unified, and this is 1968. All of this stuff took a while, folks, 50 years in some cases. Every school has at least 3 different parent councils that make decisions on scheduling, on budgets, on hiring. It's a crazy principle that does not have at least one parent on an interview committee. We talked about bilingual education in 1968. New name, dual language, much more sellable. And dual language is accelerating throughout the district. That's something they point to with pride. So, again, I know, one more, sorry. Rating of teachers and administrators in 1968 was asked for in student demands. There is a parent and a student survey every year now rating teachers and administrators. God knows what they do with the results, but at least there's a rating. So that's my spiel.
Thank you. Carlos, how are we doing on time? Okay. Well, thank you all, and thank you, Susan, for sharing this film and discussion. We'll take a little break, allow you to stretch your legs.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.